Everyone, thank you for joining us today at the Avro Venture Studio, both remotely and also in person here at the studio. We're really excited to have this discussion with Brian Zetlin. I'm Regan Hinchcliffe, the VP of Public Engagement at Avro, and Avro's on a mission to pioneer breakthrough aerospace technologies that solve critical global challenges, strengthen Canada's sovereignty, and position Canada as a world leader in innovation. Brian Zetlin is an aerospace and systems engineer, an educator, and professor with a distinguished career that includes working on NASA's iconic Canadarm project, and he's now with Virtus Solis. And Virtus Solis is on a mission to provide persistent, global, scalable energy from space with space-based solar arrays. So really excited to have him on here to talk about his career and his current projects, and also just aerospace and energy and automation in general. I've been with Avro since about May, and since then I've been on quite a journey and been meeting quantum physicists, people that work at NASA, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Axiom Space, so many cool people throughout my journey. I'm very grateful for it. And one person in particular I'm extremely grateful to have met is Brian Zetlin. He viewed my LinkedIn profile when I was out at the cabin, and I remember seeing his name, and I saw his experience, and I added him immediately, and we immediately had a conversation. And then we met, and now we're collaborating together, and really excited to be speaking with him. He's already taught me so much about the industry, and very grateful that he's come to my life. Brian, I guess I'll let you take the floor there.
Welcome and greetings to all of you. I hope you're all young and fit, because you'll be standing there for an hour and a half. And I want to thank Regan and Avro in particular. Yes, we did meet indeed over LinkedIn. The reason I connected with him wasn't his pretty face. It was that I saw Avro, and I'm old timer, as you all can see. And I still remember when Avro was building warplanes, in particular bombers. And then in one of its final incarnations, they built a jet, the Arrow, Black Arrow, that exceeded anything that we were building in the US. This is when I was a child, but I've never forgotten that. So when I saw the name, I thought, hooray, another great aerospace company has come back to life. That's how we met. And I have been impressed, consistently impressed, by the chief quality, I think, that anybody who wants to get into this kind of engineering needs to have, and that's enthusiasm. You don't necessarily have to get great grades to be a great engineer, or for that matter, to play any role in space or aerospace engineering. I will, in a moment or two, I'll tell you how I literally fell into my career. For the time being, let's just move on. Regan has agreed to be the moderator. I'm a professor, and I talk too damn much.
Yeah, we're going straight into your career now, so I think it's a good segue. You were involved in projects like bringing the Canadarm into space, working with controlled exports. When you were at NASA, you worked at Blue Origin, Axiom, other transformative aerospace projects. So let's share with the audience some of the inspirational things that you've accomplished in your career, Brian.
All right, we'll back up a few years before Canadarm. When I was a young man, I used to do a lot of running and biking. And one day I fell off my bike, and as in fell off, and wound up with 9 months in a hip-to-toe cast, during which I could not walk without crutches, drive, or do any other form of moving around. My next door neighbors were kind enough, after I got over the initial shock, I was in the hospital a long time, to invite me over to play cards. And what I didn't know at the time was that most of his friends who we played cards with were Rand Corporation. And for those of you who are not familiar with them, they're still around. Rand Corporation is, in my view, and I think in many others, the premier think tank in the world. There are others that are on a par, perhaps, like Stanford and so forth. But again, in my view, and I think in the view of most people in engineering and the sciences, they're tops. I had no business being there, but they said, look, since you're effectively paralyzed from the waist down, we're going to set you up, give you an office at UCLA, and you're going to start an arms control center. This is not the kind of arms control with the peace sign. This is tracking nuclear and other types of weapons, including satellites and rockets. And so we had mainframes, but we didn't have anything like desktops. So I proceeded to make myself a sort of instant expert. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that this is pretty new field. And so I set out to become a by God expert in particular satellites and rocketry. other areas as well, radar. And from that came a chance meeting with a guy who appointed Dr. John Clark, who appointed me to the FCC. I was 20 years younger than everybody else there. And from that came an invitation to a meeting at Los Angeles International Airport, hosted by an aerospace executive. And they asked me to come and talk about the then burgeoning field of geostationary satellites, which today basically handle just about everything up there that's heavyweight data. I found myself in a room at the airport with 5 men. Regrettably, there were far fewer women in aerospace in those days. I was asked to give a 1-hour lecture, a 1-hour talk about the economics and the technical challenges of creating a geosat to hover over South America. Nothing like that had been done. It eventually became Pan Am-Sat. I spoke for an hour, and the questions were quite intelligent. I was introduced to John and Eric and Pete and so forth, and another hour passed. And I mean, we didn't have lunch, and it was getting time for dinner. And LAX has that great big spidery looking restaurant in the middle of the airport. So they said, let's go on over, have some drinks and have dinner. And during the beginning of dinner, when we were all toasting each other, said, do you know who you've been speaking to? And I just knew the first names. And this was the crew of Apollo 12, Dick Gordon and Alan Bean and Pete Conrad being the most famous, the guy who raced Corvettes around and stuff like that. From there, 10 years later, Dick Gordon was best man at my wedding. And there's a part 2 and part 3 about that. But from that evening on, I was invited to more and more programs, symposia on the strength of my FCC connection and RAND. We'll leave that alone for now, and let's fast forward to Canadarm. In the early days of shuttle development, actually beginning in the 70s, most people understand that the first shuttle flew in, I believe, 81. The program was managed by a NASA great, a man named Bo Bamick. I knew Bo personally. And there's another guy there who came from Northrop named Ron Kubicki. And Ron was dual citizen, which I don't think had much to do with it. But Ron was charged by NASA with getting over the export control problems that we had even with our best neighbors next door. And so Ron came to me and he said, you're a sneaky, clever son of a bitch. Help me on this. Because I had some experience at the State Department. So we worked on it. And by God, it was the State Department that made it happen. We got it authorized and approved, and then began the process of integrating it. And I have to say, McDonald Detweiler was one of the principal teams. You folks had done a lot of the integration work in anticipation of our being able to install it. They're very complex. We're not going to talk about Newtonian effects in space, but they're very complex mechanics about operating any system in a zero gravity environment. It's nothing like easier. In fact, it's much more complex in terms of leverage and so forth. I'd rather not do the litany of who I worked for and where I worked and all of that. I'll just go through the high points.
Yeah, that's great, Brian.
Yeah, and also adding that I have a lot of experience in nuclear systems and as well as general energy. In 1982, I was asked to join a brand new firm called Science and Engineering Associates. All the other people in the firm came out of the National Laboratory System, and our chief business was designing systems to protect satellites, rockets, and aircraft from nuclear effects. Chief among them, EMP. And for those of you who don't know what that is, electromagnetic pulse is an effect produced by very large explosions, which disables or destroys all electronics, period. And we were terrified, as were all the great powers, of these devices. This small nuclear weapon that detonated in space doesn't hurt anybody, but it stops all aircraft from flying, all computers from operating, medical systems. And so we became first and foremost in that field, working through the laboratories and especially working through Department of Defense. Along the trail there, I was chief troubleshooter. That was actually the title on my card for Boeing Military Airplane Company. I also worked on Hughes satellites and Boeing satellites at the time. Went on from there to form my own company, Seattle Scientific Corp., which I closed down 20 years to the day after I opened it. And during that period, I worked and consulted to the Russian Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, ESA, NASA, and even the old Canadian Space Agency. Also worked on Atlas rockets. I worked on the RS-25 engines. Alas, I was too young for the F-1s, but the RS-25s were the shuttle rocket engines. And during that period, picked up a rep for being a good program manager. Now, going back into Regan's experience, I want to add that there's some other qualities, and this has to do with employment, but it also has to do with having a satisfying and fulfilling career. You can have plenty of doubts about your abilities, and professors like me will beat that out of you. If you have promise, we'll get it out of you. You need energy and you need enthusiasm, and you need to ask yourself, am I a good connector of dots? Do I have the combination of logic, native intelligence, observational skills to be able to make leaps of logic, to connect things that are otherwise not there? That's basically my chief talent. And also the sneaky son of a bitch stuff, which I've been called more than once. During that tenure, I also served on the Federal Aviation Administration as what's called a designated engineering representative. My job was to help design systems to protect rockets and aircraft from lightning strikes. I've also worked on human spaceflight. Let me get to part 2 of the astronaut story. Shortly after Dick Gordon was best man at my wedding, he came to work for me. The reason was that in the United States, even astronauts retire on military pay. And even in those days, he was captain, and military pay was about a third of what it took to lead a decent life. His wife called me and said, help. I said, sure. And he worked for me for several years. I don't think we ever did any technical work. It was mainly politicking and working government issues. And Pete Conrad was along for that ride. And Pete and Dick and I went to Dan Golden in the 90s when he was the administrator at NASA. Of course, they were both friends, and proposed a solid rocket system, which he laughed out of his office, and rightly. But still, being a part of that all those entire communities subsequently led to working for a brief time at Blue Origin and getting a very deep sense, because I've hired something like 1,200 people and run a half a dozen companies, of why a literally bottomless pit of funding and a couple of thousand brilliant engineers could not put a rocket out, while SpaceX was putting out tens and then hundreds. That informed, and it still does inform, my experience. Most recently, I've just come off of a stint at Axiom Space, which is based in Houston. And my title, which was a NASA title, was Senior Program Manager, Lunar Terrain Vehicle. And I'm sure that you've seen antique films and more modern ones of rovers. My chief charge, which is to act between the builder of the rover, Axiom, and NASA, and this is the NASA program manager, was to integrate the suit with the rover. And for those of you who are interested in manned flight, but now called human space flight,